Tuscany is basically Italy's greatest hits album. It's the birthplace of the Renaissance, the home of the modern Italian language, and the only place on earth where a dirt road lined with trees is considered a legitimate tourist attraction. Located right in the middle of the Italian boot, Tuscany covers 23,000 square kilometers and is home to 4 million people. It's also home to Florence, Siena, Pisa, and about half of the world's remaining artistic heritage, give or take a Michelangelo. UNESCO has blessed this place with 7 World Heritage Sites, which is more than some continents can claim. To visit Tuscany is to subject yourself to a very specific kind of beautiful torture. You will rent a charming Fiat, and you will immediately scrape it against a 14th century archway. You'll deal with aggressive Vespers, pay a minor fortune to sleep in a renovated barn, and get slapped with a ruinous fine for driving into a restricted traffic zone that you definitely didn't see the sign for. You will also watch thousands of grown adults pretending to hold up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. 5 million people travel to Tuscany every year. They come for the art, the food, and the photo opportunities. What they find is a place that somehow lives up to the hype, while also being more expensive and more beautiful than anything could prepare them for. Florence is smaller than Rome and quieter than Milan, yet this is the place most responsible for the Renaissance happening in the first place. This is the origin point of a cultural explosion that reshaped painting, sculpture, architecture, and human self-regard for the next 500 years. Today, it's the capital of Tuscany and home to 400,000 residents. Florence sits along the Arno River, tucked into a valley surrounded by hills covered in olive trees and cypress. It's landlocked, about 80 kilometers from the coast. Despite that inland position, it became one of the wealthiest trading cities in medieval Europe. The churches, the palaces, the art, all of it was largely funded by banking and wool. Not gold, not conquest. Wool and interest rates. During the Middle Ages, Florence became a republic, a real one, with guilds, elected officials, and constant infighting between rival families. Politics here was less civic duty and more extreme contact sport. Then came the Medici, a banking family that started as wool merchants and ended up running the city, funding half the Renaissance and producing several popes along the way. Not bad for a family whose name literally translates to doctors. The Medici didn't just fund artists, they built an entire ecosystem where painters, sculptors and architects had money, freedom and reason to compete with each other. That competition produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Brunelleschi and dozens more. In about 200 years, this one city redefined Western art. Then, slowly, decline set in. The Medici line ended in the 18th century. Florence joined unified Italy in 1861 and briefly served as the country's capital from 1865 to 1871, before Rome took over the job permanently. Today, the local economy leans heavily on the legacy of that creative output, which, to be fair, is a solid business model. Florence's importance to Italy goes beyond tourism revenue, though that's substantial. This is where the modern Italian language essentially originated. Dante Alighieri, Florence's most famous literary export, wrote the Divine Comedy in the Tuscan dialect instead of Latin, and that single decision helped standardize what eventually became modern Italian. So the next time someone orders a cappuccino in Rome, they can thank a 14th century poet who was extremely bitter about being exiled from his own city. Florence also produced political theory's most quoted cynic, Niccolò Machiavelli, whose book, The Prince, remains assigned reading for anyone interested in acquiring power and keeping it, ethics aside. The city's greatest attraction is visible from almost anywhere in the city. The Cattedrale di Santa Maria del Fiore, or just the Duomo if you're in a hurry. Construction began in 1296 and took nearly 150 years. Builders finished the walls first and figured they'd deal with the dome later. Later turned out to be over a century, until architect Filippo Brunelleschi came up with a design nobody had attempted since ancient Rome, a self-supporting double-shell dome, built without traditional wooden scaffolding, using a herringbone brick pattern that distributed weight in ways engineers still study today. Completed in 1436, it remains the largest brick dome ever built. You can climb it, all 463 steps, and yes, it's tight, hot, and claustrophobic, but the view from the top makes the sweat worth it. A short walk away is the Uffizi Gallery, one of the oldest and most important art museums in the world. Originally built in the 16th century as government offices, it later became a gallery to house the Medici family's private art collection. The Galleria dell'Accademia holds Michelangelo's David, arguably the most famous sculpture on earth. Carved from a single block of marble that two other sculptors had already given up on, Michelangelo finished it in 1504 at the age of 29. Ponte Vecchio, the Old Bridge, crosses the Arno and has done so in some form since Roman times. The current structure dates to 1345, famous for the shops built directly onto it. Butchers and tanners originally occupied the bridge until the smell became unbearable and the Medici banned them and brought in goldsmiths instead. The bridge remained standing after World War II bombing that destroyed nearly every other bridge in Florence, reportedly by direct order of a German commander who considered it too remarkable to destroy. Getting here isn't difficult. Florence Airport sits 5 kilometers from the historic centre, though it's small enough that international hub feels like a generous description. Most travellers fly into Rome or Milan and take the train instead, which is honestly the better plan anyway. There's no metro here, which surprises people expecting big city infrastructure. Walking is really the only sane way to see the centre. Siena sits in the middle of Tuscany, 70 kilometers south of Florence. It's a hill town, properly hilly, built across 3 ridges that meet in the middle, which explains why every street here goes either sharply up or sharply down. According to legend, Siena was founded by Cineas, son of Remus, who you'll remember from the Rome origins story, as one half of the wolf-suckled brothers who founded Rome. This explains why the she-wolf symbol turns up constantly around Siena, on flags, on statues, on pretty much anything that holds still long enough to be decorated. The Etruscans and later the Romans had settlements here, but Siena really came into its own in the Middle Ages, when it developed into an independent city-state and a serious banking power. The Monte dei Paschi di Siena, founded in 1472, is the oldest surviving bank in the world. The rivalry with Florence wasn't only cultural, it got fully militarized, including the Battle of Montepulciano in 1260, one of the bloodiest battles fought on Italian soil during the Middle Ages, which Siena actually won. Locals commemorated the victory for generations, mostly because there weren't many more wins to commemorate after Florence's forces came back 3 centuries later and finished the job properly. Siena's importance within Tuscany today is mostly cultural rather than economic, though the banking legacy still counts for something on paper. This is a city that essentially stopped growing at the height of the Middle Ages, whether by decline or design, and the result is one of the most intact medieval layouts anywhere in Italy. UNESCO named the historic centre a World Heritage Site in 1995, which is about the closest thing to a trophy Siena has picked up since the 1200s. Twice a year, in July and August, the city runs a bareback horse race around the main square, involving 10 of the 17 historic districts, each with its own name, flag, colours and centuries of loyalty that make English football rivalries look like a mild disagreement over parking. The race itself lasts about 90 seconds. The build-up lasts for weeks, involves blessing the horses inside churches, and produces the kind of tension usually reserved for national elections. Watching grown adults burst into tears over a race shorter than most ad breaks tells you everything about how seriously unresolved medieval pride can still be taken in the 21st century. This isn't a sport here, it's closer to a religion crossed with a blood feud. The race takes place in Piazza del Campo, one of the great public squares in Europe. It's shell-shaped, sloped and paved in a pattern of red brick, divided into 9 sections, representing the medieval council that once ran the city. At the highest point stands the Palazzo Pubblico, Siena's town hall, still functioning as a government building today, and beside it the Torre del Mangia, a bell tower stretching over 87 metres into the sky. Then there's Siena Cathedral, the Duomo, which represents one of history's greatest cases of architectural overreach meeting reality with full force. In the 14th century, city leaders decided to expand the cathedral into what would have been the largest church in the Christian world, bigger than St. Peter's in Rome. Construction began, walls went up, and then the Black Death arrived in 1348 and removed most of the workforce along with 2/3 of the population. The expansion stopped permanently. Today, the unfinished wall of what would have been the new nave still stands beside the existing cathedral. Getting to Siena is where things get slightly less convenient. The train connection from Florence is oddly bad for 2 cities this close together, requiring a change and well over 90 minutes for a trip a car finishes in under an hour. Most people take the bus instead, which runs direct from Florence and drops passengers right at the edge of the old centre. Driving works too, especially if you're planning to explore more of Tuscany afterward. Before we continue this journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to World Travel Guide. Livorno sits on the Ligurian coast of Tuscany. 150,000 people live here, and it's a proper city rather than the hill town fantasy most people have already built in their heads before they've even landed in Italy. Livorno doesn't have hills. It doesn't have winding medieval lanes either. It has grid patterns, canals, and shipping containers, and if you show up expecting a typical Tuscany landscape, you're going to have a small crisis somewhere around the second roundabout. Livorno's story kicks off embarrassingly late by Tuscany standards, which is why it looks so different from everywhere else in the region. In 1577, Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici decided Tuscany needed a proper deep-water port, and commissioned architect Bernardo Buontalenti to design an entirely new city from scratch. This makes Livorno one of the first planned ideal cities of the Renaissance, built on a strict geometric grid with star-shaped fortifications, which explains why the old centre feels more like a very elegant chessboard than the organic medieval sprawl found everywhere else in Tuscany. In 1593, the Medici doubled down with the Livornian laws, offering religious freedom and tax breaks to any merchant willing to relocate. No questions asked about background, which is either remarkably progressive for the 1590s or just a very shrewd business plan dressed up as tolerance. Jewish, Greek, Armenian, English and Dutch merchants flooded in, and Livorno became the most cosmopolitan city in Italy. Economically, Livorno anchors the one part of Tuscany that has nothing to do with wine tastings or fresco restoration, and everything to do with shipping containers and industrial logistics. This is the region's main commercial port, handling a serious share of Tuscany's trade, plus a significant naval presence. Tourism here operates on an entirely different planet from the rest of Tuscany. Livorno gets whatever's left over after everyone's finished elbowing each other in Florence, and yet, technically, more people pass through Livorno every year than through most of Tuscany combined, because it has one of the busiest cruise ports in the entire Mediterranean. The Fortezza Nuova, the new fortress, was built in the late 16th century. It's blocky, defensive, and about as decorative as a filing cabinet. It's surrounded by canals leading into Venezia Nuova, the new Venice, a 17th century district built with genuine Venetian influence. Narrow waterways, small bridges, buildings rising straight out of the canal. Boat tours run through it, offering essentially the Venice experience, minus the eye-watering gondola prices and without the crowd density of a music festival. Terrazza Mascagni is a vast seafront terrace paved in a black and white checkerboard pattern stretching along the coast for a serious distance. It's one of the most striking public spaces in Tuscany, mostly because there's no queue and no gift shop, just open sea and, on a clear day, the outline of Corsica sitting on the horizon. Traffic in Livorno reflects the fact that this was a planned city. Wide boulevards, proper circulation, roads roads clearly designed with actual vehicles in mind, rather than 14th century donkey carts. This makes Livorno dramatically easier to drive through than Florence or Siena, where every street seems personally designed to trap a rental car and never let it leave. The one exception is Port Day, when a cruise ship the size of a small nation docks and unloads several thousand people simultaneously, all trying to find the same bus, creating a bottleneck that briefly resembles an evacuation drill. Getting to Livorno is refreshingly simple, which almost feels like cheating after dealing with Siena's transport situation. Pisa International Airport sits under 20 kilometers away. The train from Florence takes just over 90 minutes, and Pisa is a mere 15 to 20 minutes by rail, a connection very quick and reliable. The port itself runs ferries to Sardinia, Corsica and Elba, alongside a steady flow of cruise traffic. Pisa sits on the Arno River in western Tuscany, just a short hop from the coast, close enough to the sea that it was actually a major maritime power once. 90,000 people live here, a population size that would be entirely unremarkable if not for the fact that this small university city receives the same tourist attention as a place 10 times its size, all thanks to one architectural mistake that turned into the most profitable blunder in the history of construction. Pisa's story starts a long way from the Leaning Tower and a long way before anyone in Florence had even picked up a paintbrush. In the Middle Ages, Pisa was one of the 4 great maritime republics of Italy, alongside Venice, Genoa and Amalfi, controlling naval trade routes across the Mediterranean and building an empire that stretched as far as Sardinia, Corsica and parts of the Holy Land. This was serious power, backed by serious wealth, most of it earned the old-fashioned way: trade, conquest, and a fleet of ships that other cities were rather afraid of. Then, in 1284, Pisa lost the Battle of Maloria to Genoa, a naval disaster so complete that it essentially ended Pisa's status as a maritime superpower overnight. From there, Pisa slowly declined, got folded into Florence's growing sphere of influence, and eventually became just another town under Medici control. Despite the fall from power, Pisa held on to one thing Florence never quite matched: a serious intellectual legacy, largely thanks to the University of Pisa, founded in 1343, and its most famous alumnus, Galileo Galilei, who was born here in 1564 and reportedly used the Leaning Tower itself to drop objects of different weights, testing gravity in a way that would get you arrested today, but got him a permanent spot in every physics textbook ever printed. The Torre di Pisa, or Leaning Tower, began construction in 1173 as the freestanding bell tower for the cathedral next door. By the time builders reached the 3rd floor, in 1178, the tower had already started sinking into the soft, unstable subsoil beneath it, because someone, at some point, apparently skipped the part where you check what kind of ground you're building an enormous stone tower on. Construction stopped for nearly a century due to ongoing wars, which, unintentionally, gave the ground time to settle slightly, and probably saved the whole structure from collapsing outright. When building resumed, engineers tried to correct the lean by making the upper floors slightly taller on one side. It didn't fully work, and the tower has been leaning ever since, completed in 1372, nearly 200 years after it started. At its worst point in the 20th century, the tilt reached almost 5.5 degrees. The current lean sits at just under 4 degrees, which engineers insist will hold steady for at least another 200 years. The cathedral itself predates the tower by over a century and remains a masterpiece of the Pisan Romanesque style, with a striped marble facade that basically every other building in the square borrowed from afterward. Inside, an enormous bronze chandelier is popularly linked to Galileo's discovery of the pendulum's regular swing. Tourism in Pisa runs almost entirely on the reputation of a single building. Millions of visitors show up every year, and the overwhelming majority of them do the exact same thing: walk to the Field of Miracles, take a photograph pretending to push, hold or karate chop the tower, buy a miniature Leaning Tower keyring and leave within about 3 hours. It's less a visit and more a very efficient photo-based pilgrimage. This has created a slightly odd dynamic, where Pisa is simultaneously simultaneously one of the most visited cities in Tuscany and one of the least explored, because almost nobody bothers venturing beyond the one square where the famous tilt happens. The rest of the city, which is genuinely pleasant, sits practically empty of tourists. Val d'Orcia sits south of Siena, stretching down toward Monte Amiata, an extinct volcano that marks the valley's southern edge, and east toward the border with the province of Grosseto. It's drained by the Orcia River, which eventually feeds into the larger Ombrone River on its way to the sea, though nobody visits the region to look at the river. They come for the hills, the cypress trees, and the sort of golden light that makes every amateur photographer briefly believe they've developed genuine talent. This isn't a city or even a single town, it's an entire valley, 180 square kilometres of rolling farmland dotted with a handful of small hill towns, none of which individually amounts to much, but together form what most people actually imagine when someone says the word Tuscany. Geographically, this is Tuscany reduced to its purest form. Chalky clay hills up north, called Crete Senesi, softening into richer farmland further south, which is why this land has been farmed intensively since Roman times. Val d'Orcia earned UNESCO World Heritage status in 2004, and the reasoning given is genuinely one of the odder justifications in the whole UNESCO catalogue. The site was recognised not just for its beauty, but because this specific landscape helped define the Renaissance idea of what an ideal landscape should even look like. Sienese painters, including Ambrogio Lorenzetti in his famous fresco cycle Allegory of Good Government, used views very similar to Val d'Orcia to represent the concept of a well-managed, harmonious society back in the 14th century. So this valley isn't just scenic, it's technically been influencing Western ideas about beauty and order for 700 years. Tourism in Val d'Orcia developed very differently from Florence or Siena, since there's no single dominant monument pulling in crowds. Instead, the entire region sells one product, the view itself. The single most photographed stretch of road in the whole valley, a winding gravel path lined symmetrically with cypress trees near San Quirico d'Orcia, has appeared in countless car commercials and films, largely because it requires zero editing to look like something from a fantasy about the Italian countryside. The valley's iconic cypress trees weren't originally planted for scenery at all, they were used historically as windbreaks and property markers. The English Patient, the Oscar-winning film from 1996, used Pienza and the surrounding countryside extensively during filming, cementing Val d'Orcia's reputation among international audiences years before mass tourism caught up. Roughly 1 million visitors pass through the wider valley each year. Most visitors arrive by rental car, since public transport here ranges from limited to non-existent. There's no train line running directly through Val d'Orcia, the nearest useful stations sitting in Chiusi Chianciano Terme or Buonconvento, both requiring a further drive to actually reach any of the hill towns. This is, unapologetically, a road trip destination, which explains why the roads themselves have become as famous as the towns they connect. Give it 2 days, rent the smallest car you can find, and accept that at some point you will stop the car in the middle of an empty road just to stare at a hill. Don't worry, by that point so has everyone else in Tuscany. San Gimignano rises above the Elsa Valley in the province of Siena, visible from a long way off thanks to a skyline that looks nothing like the rest of medieval Tuscany. Towers, stone towers, jutting up from a town of maybe a few thousand people, like someone tried to build a miniature Manhattan out of travertine. That's not a stretch, by the way. People genuinely call it medieval Manhattan. It's a small walled town that knew, several centuries before skyscrapers were a global obsession, that height equals status. Rome had aqueducts, Florence had domes. San Gimignano had a bunch of rich families competing to see who could build the tallest stone tower. The town's name comes with a legend, and like most medieval legends, it's the kind of story that raises more questions than it answers. San Gimignano was a bishop from Modena, a guy whose entire resume, as far as history bothered to record, consists of one really good day at work. According to the story, Attila the Hun, fresh off a rampage across Europe and looking for another town to ruin, showed up outside the walls with an army. But the bishop appeared on the walls and scared him off with sheer divine presence. Attila took one look and left. Nobody asked for evidence at the time, and nobody's asking now. Attila probably moved on for entirely logistical reasons that had nothing to do with any bishop at all. But that's a boring explanation, and boring explanations don't get you a patron saint. The town's real fortune came from its location. San Gimignano sat directly on the Via Francigena, the pilgrim road running from Canterbury to Rome. Pilgrims needed beds, food and wine. San Gimignano provided all three, along with saffron, which the town produced and exported across Europe at high prices. Then came 1348, and the Black Death arrived like an uninvited guest. San Gimignano's population collapsed. Trade routes shifted. The Via Francigena lost relevance. The town, weakened and broke, submitted to Florence in 1353. The path to popularity wasn't instant. For centuries, San Gimignano was just a footnote. The turning point came through a mix of preservation efforts, growing interest in medieval Italy, and UNESCO, which added the town to its World Heritage List in 1990, officially declaring the skyline worth protecting. The town's population today is just over 8,000 people across the entire commune, which includes the surrounding countryside and smaller villages. Inside the historic walls, the number living full-time is far smaller, likely a few hundred, most of them running restaurants or gelato shops for people who don't live there at all. This is not unusual for Tuscany, but it's especially pronounced here. Inside the walls, the towers are obviously the headline attraction. Of the 14 remaining, Torre Grossa stands the tallest at 54 metres and is the only one open to the public for climbing. The staircase is steep and unforgiving toward anyone with knee problems, but the view from the top delivers exactly what it promises: red rooftops, the remaining towers standing at odd intervals, and the Tuscan countryside stretching out in every direction, uninterrupted by anything modern. And then there's ice cream. San Gimignano has the best ice cream in the world. Gelateria Dondoli, located just off Piazza della Cisterna, has won the World Gelato Championship multiple times, which is a real competition with real judges who apparently take frozen dairy very seriously. For visitors seeking something less pleasant, the town offers a museum of torture, a genre of attraction that exists in several Italian towns and always draws a curious crowd, regardless of taste level. If you travel through southern Tuscany's Maremma region, you might stumble upon Cascate del Mulino, right at the edge of the town of Saturnia, roughly 2 hours south of Florence. It's a series of natural travertine pools and small waterfalls, fed by thermal water that comes out of the ground at a steady 37.5 degrees Celsius year-round. That's warm bath temperature delivered by the earth itself, for free, forever, no plumber required. The water flow rate is around 800 litres per second, which is an absurd amount of warm water, constantly refreshing the pools. The water comes from a volcanic source, rich in sulphur, which means the whole place smells faintly like bad eggs. You'll smell it before you see it. It's not overpowering, but it's noticeable enough that first-time visitors usually pause, sniff the air, and quietly wonder if something nearby is on fire or just extremely old. The pools themselves formed over thousands of years as the mineral-rich water flowed downhill and deposited layer after layer of travertine, creating smooth, rounded basins that step down the hillside like a staircase. Each pool connects to the next through small waterfalls, so the water constantly moves, keeps a steady temperature, and never sits still long enough to get gross, which is good considering how many people are standing in it at any given moment. This water has been in use since Roman times, and the Romans, never known for skipping a good bath, took full advantage. For a long time, this was mostly a local secret known to people in the region. Then, at some point in the last couple of decades, word got out. Photos circulated, articles got written listing it among the best free attractions in Tuscany, a rare species of attraction that involves no ticket booth. And so, predictably, everyone showed up. Today, Cascate del Mulino receives a serious volume of visitors, especially during summer weekends. Peak season turns the whole experience into a group activity you didn't sign up for, with strangers occupying every ledge, every waterfall, and every flat rock large enough to sit on. You just walk down, find a pool, and get in. Now you're sharing a warm mineral pool with 40 other people. Some in swimsuits, some who clearly didn't plan for this, and are wading in fully clothed, holding their phone above their head like they're fording a river in a war film. You should bring water shoes, because the travertine, while smooth in photos, is rough and sharp underfoot, and walking barefoot across it feels like a mild punishment. Montepulciano sits at just over 600 metres, high enough that Val d'Orcia stretches out on one side and Val di Chiana on the other. The town's history involves several hundred years of the town getting passed back and forth between Siena and Florence. This went on for centuries, punctuated by sieges, betrayals, and at least one period where Montepulciano briefly declared itself independent of everyone, an arrangement that lasted about as long as most New Year's resolutions. The historic centre spreads mostly along a single spine road called Corso that runs from the bottom of the hill straight up to the top. The town's layout follows the ridge in a long, narrow line rather than the more common concentric circles found in places like Siena. The climate here runs warm, dry summers and cool, often foggy winters, with the surrounding hills occasionally disappearing into a thick blanket of mist that locals treat as completely unremarkable and visitors treat as a minor natural phenomenon worth photographing. Cars can enter parts of the lower town, but the steepest stretches near the top are pedestrian by necessity rather than by official decree, since no reasonable vehicle would attempt that gradient more than once. Most visitors park near the base at one of the lots ringing the outer walls, and treat the climb itself as a mandatory entry fee, paid in leg muscles rather than euros. Walking up the Corso means passing enoteca after enoteca, many built into cellars carved directly into the tufa rock beneath the town centuries ago, kept naturally cool enough to age wine properly without any modern equipment. Some of these cellars connect to tunnels running beneath multiple buildings, remnants of a network originally used for storage, and, during less peaceful centuries, escape routes when the current ruling city-state fell out of favour. Wine is why anyone comes here, and it's been produced in this specific spot since at least the 8th century. Vino Nobile di Montepulciano earned its name because it was historically favoured by nobility and clergy, meaning wealthy people drank it first and made absolutely sure word got around. Confusingly, none of this has anything to do with the Montepulciano grape, which is a completely different variety grown mostly further south in Abruzzo. Have you ever been to Tuscany? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to World Travel Guide.